The price of being the responsible daughter. I learned exactly where I ranked in my family the night my dad lifted his glass at dinner and announced, "Congrats. Here's your car, son." The sound of everyone clapping was a clean, sharp sound. Then he turned to me, the spotlight extinguished, and handed me a crumpled bill instead of a smile. Rent due by Sunday. In that single, brutal moment, years of quiet favoritism and unacknowledged sacrifice snapped into an undeniable focus. I forced a smile, swallowed the lump of betrayal in my throat, and said nothing. But something inside me, the loyal daughter, the tireless helper, packed its bags and walked out. What happened next didn't explode at the table. It unfolded slowly, precisely, and left my entire family unraveling. Before I get into it, tap like, tell me where you're listening from, and share your advice matters. My name is Sarah. On paper, I look like the child parents are supposed to brag about. I work in social services, the kind of job where you sit across from people on their worst day and try to steady the ground beneath their feet. I learned early how to stay calm, how to listen, how to hold things together when the emotional stakes were impossibly high. The irony? I learned most of that critical skill set at home. Our house always looked solid from the outside. The neatly trimmed lawn, the family photos lined up in their matching frames, the Sunday dinners that began exactly on time. My dad built his career with his hands, turning long days and stubborn pride into a successful business that demanded respect. My mom taught young children, came home smelling faintly of crayons and coffee, and believed that peace was something you preserved by never poking at the cracks. And then there was my brother. He is younger, charming in an effortless, sunlight and laughter way, the kind of person people forgive before he even asks for it. Growing up, it felt like we lived under the same roof, but were governed by different laws of physics. When he struggled, the entire house leaned in, worried and attentive. When I succeeded, it was background noise, an expected minimum already accounted for. No one ever sat me down to say, "We expect more from you, Sarah." They didn't have to. It was in the silences. In the way my report cards were merely skimmed while his were debated and discussed. In the way my choices were questioned and scrutinized while his were encouraged with blind faith. I became the reliable one, the fixer, the crisis manager, the daughter who silently filled in every gap without needing to be asked. After college, I moved back home with a practical plan. Save money, gain experience, apply to graduate school. I covered groceries, sometimes paid bills when something broke, and picked up the slack without ever keeping a score. Living there was meant to be temporary, a logistical necessity. My mom used to offer the ultimate hollow comfort: "Your dad just trusts you more." As if trust explained why responsibility only flowed in one punishing direction. As if being capable meant you no longer deserved or needed support. I told myself it didn't bother me. I rationalized that families are complicated, and love shows up in different, sometimes twisted forms. I believed that if I stayed steady long enough, things would eventually balance out, that someday, my dad would look at me and see not just the dependable daughter, but someone truly worth celebrating too. That fragile belief is what I carried into the summer of my brother's graduation. The oppressive heat, the long days, the feeling that something significant was shifting, even if I didn't yet know how sharply. And looking back now, that's the part that stings the most. I walked into that dinner still thinking I belonged. The weeks leading up to my brother's graduation felt deeply off in a way I couldn't articulate. The house buzzed with frantic planning energy, but none of it included me in any meaningful way. My mom talked nonstop about the guest list, flipping through recipes at the kitchen counter. My dad disappeared into the garage more often than usual, the door always shut, his voice dropping to a low, secretive murmur whenever I walked past. When I asked simple, practical questions, what time people were coming, did we need more chairs, I got vague, dismissive answers. We've got it covered. I told myself I was paranoid, imagining things. The day of the graduation arrived, hot and blindingly bright, the kind of summer Saturday that amplifies every emotion. I helped clean, I polished the dining table, I arranged the flowers my mom insisted were necessary. My brother paced around in his cap and gown, nervous, but vibrating with excitement. I straightened his collar without thinking, the same automatic gesture I'd made 100 times before every big moment in his life. At the ceremony, my dad clapped louder than anyone when my brother's name was called. He stood up, halfway, beaming like this was his personal, triumphant victory. I clapped too, genuinely proud, even as a small, familiar, dull ache settled into my chest. I remembered my own graduations, how my dad had been technically present, already checking his phone by the time my name was announced. Back home, the house filled quickly. Relatives, neighbors, family friends. Laughter bounced off the walls. Plates clinked. I floated between rooms, refilling drinks, answering questions about my own demanding work with a fixed smile, all while people congratulated my brother. The garage door stayed closed the entire time, like it was guarding a precious secret. Dinner was loud and crowded. My dad stood at the head of the table, glass raised, waiting for a profound silence. He talked about hard work, perseverance, and how the ones who push through adversity deserve recognition. I watched the way his words leaned toward my brother, how his hand rested possessively on his shoulder. Then he pulled out the keys. They caught the light when he held them up, metal flashing, unmistakable. A car. A big one, brand new, worth more than I had ever spent on myself combined. The room erupted. Chairs scraped back. People cheered. My brother's face went from shock to pure, radiant joy. I clapped. I smiled. My hands did exactly what they had been trained to do. After the noise finally died down, after people drifted toward the garage to see the car up close, my dad caught my eye and nodded toward the hallway. Just a quick, private conversation, the look said. Nothing dramatic. In the sterile quiet of the kitchen, away from the applause, his tone changed instantly. It became practical, measured, utterly devoid of warmth. You've been here a while, he said, like he was delivering a quarterly review. It's time you start paying rent. $900 by Sunday. For a surreal moment, I honestly thought he was joking. The timing was too monstrous, too perfectly cruel to be real. I looked past him toward the garage, where my brother was laughing, his hands gripping the steering wheel of his brand new Freedom. Something clicked into place. Then, not anger, not heartbreak yet, just absolute clarity. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a line being drawn in the sand, and I had been standing on the wrong side of it my entire life. The rest of the night moved around me like I was watching a film in which I was a ghost. I stood near the sink, pointlessly rinsing plates, nodding politely, waiting for the cold, hollow feeling in my chest to pass. It didn't. When the house finally quieted down, I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the wall. $900. By Sunday. The number echoed in my head, Not because I couldn't afford it, but because of what it truly signified. It wasn't about money, it was a verdict. I thought about all the payments I'd covered without being asked: groceries, repairs, emergency bills that mysteriously landed on my plate because I was the only one capable. None of that had been rent. Rent, apparently, was something reserved for moments like this. Moments when I needed to be brutally reminded of my subordinate place. Sleep was impossible. Sometime after midnight, I opened my laptop and pulled up my bank account. Years of careful, quiet savings stared back at me. Enough to move, enough to breathe, enough to stop negotiating my own worth one invisible favor at a time. In the morning, the house was already buzzing again. My dad and brother were making plans for the car's maiden drive. My mom hovered, cheerful in that brittle way she had when she was desperately trying to glue the pieces of a normal life back together. No one mentioned the conversation from the night before. That silence told me everything. I waited until they left. The quiet that followed was heavy but clean. I started with my closet, folding clothes into neat, final piles. Each decision felt oddly calm. I skipped the things tied to the old, patient version of myself, the one who believed endurance would eventually be rewarded. At my desk, I paused with a pen, staring at a blank piece of paper. I didn't write an essay. I didn't argue my case. I kept it simple, honest, and final. I'm moving out. I'm taking responsibility for my life, fully. Please don't look for me until I reach out. I folded the note once and placed it on the fridge, held down by a magnet that had been there for years. Then I carried my bags to my car and didn't look back. The pushback didn't come right away. It started as silence, then a bewildered text from my brother asking if this was some kind of joke, then missed calls from my mom. By the time I pulled onto the highway, my phone buzzed again and again in the passenger seat. I didn't answer, not because I was angry, but because for the first time, I was choosing not to explain myself to people who had already so clearly decided what I was worth. And that single choice changed everything. I didn't go far that first night. I drove until the streetlights blurred together, then parked in the lot of a grocery store that stayed open late, the kind with buzzing fluorescent lights and the distant rattling of carts. I sat there with my hands on the steering wheel, breathing in short, shallow bursts, trying to understand how a single sentence, $900 by Sunday, could hollow out so many years at once. My phone lit up again. My brother's name. Are you okay? Mom's freaking out. Dad says you overreacted. I stared at the screen, locked it, and set the phone face down. I didn't owe anyone an immediate, composed version of myself. Not tonight. I stayed with my best friend that first week. She didn't ask many questions. She just handed me a spare key, cleared out a drawer, and said, "Stay as long as you need." The sheer, unconditioned simplicity of it almost made me cry. No lectures, no conditions, just sanctuary. The messages kept coming, mostly from my mom. Long voicemails that swung wildly between tearful worry and quiet accusation. She wanted to talk this through. She wanted me to come home so we could be a family again. She never mentioned the rent, never mentioned the toxic timing, as if ignoring the trigger might erase the explosion. My dad didn't call at first. When he did, it was brief and chillingly controlled. "This is unnecessary," he lectured. "Adults don't storm off." I almost laughed. I hadn't stormed. I had packed quietly. If anything, it was the calmest, most adult decision I had ever made. A few days later, my brother called. Not texted. Called. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice thinner than usual, less sure of its own privilege. We met at a coffee shop halfway between my friend's place and the house, neutral ground. He showed up early, tapping his foot, phone in hand like a lifeline. I didn't know, he confessed as soon as I sat down. About the rent thing. Dad didn't say anything. I know, I replied, and I meant it. None of this was his fault. He leaned back, rubbing his face with a weary hand. Everything's weird at home. Mom keeps crying. Dad's mad all the time. And now they're asking me about stuff you used to handle. Bills, appointments, things I don't even know where to start with. I watched him process that reality aloud. The confusion creeping in. For the first time, the feather-soft cushion under him was gone. I'm not disappearing, I told him gently. I'm just not doing it for everyone anymore. He nodded slowly, like the idea scared him, but also made a terrible kind of sense. That conversation stayed with me because it was the moment I understood the real shift had already happened. I didn't have to do anything dramatic. The system was already unraveling on its own. The real confrontation came later, not at the dinner table, but on a quiet afternoon when my dad showed up at my friend's place unannounced. I opened the door and found him standing there, hands in his pockets, his jaw tight with suppressed rage. He looked around the small apartment like the very space offended his sensibilities. "Can we talk?" he asked. I stepped aside. We sat across from each other, the space between us charged with everything that had been left unforgivably unsaid. He didn't waste time. "You embarrassed us," he said. "You made a scene." I left quietly, I replied, holding his gaze. "That's not a scene. You blindsided us." "I gave you a rent demand at my brother's celebration," I countered. "That was the blind side." He waved it off dismissively. "That's business. You're an adult. Adults pay their way." "And yet," I said, "you bought him a car worth more than I've ever spent on myself." "That's different," he insisted. I waited. I let the silence do the excruciating work. He needed encouragement, his voice shrinking slightly. "My son needed encouragement, Sarah. You've always been fine on your own." There it was again. The tired, familiar, destructive script. "So, because I handle things," I asked, my voice dangerously level, "I get less?" He sighed like I was exhausting him with my logic. "You're comparing apples and oranges." I leaned forward. "No. I'm comparing effort and reward. I'm comparing responsibility and support, and I'm asking why those only flow in one direction." He hesitated for just a second. Then he said the words that shattered the illusion forever, "because he's worth it." The words landed heavy and clean, with no apology, no caveat wrapped around them. For a moment, I felt something crack open inside me. Not pain, but a profound, almost dizzying relief. Because the question I'd been asking my entire life finally had an undeniable, honest answer. I stood up. "I'm not here to argue with you," I said. "I just needed to hear that." "Hear what?" he snapped, suddenly anxious. "That I was never going to win," I said calmly. "Not by being responsible. Not by being patient. Not by staying." He frowned. "You're twisting this." "No," I said, walking him to the door. "I'm accepting it." He looked truly stunned, like he'd expected tears, or yelling, or some form of emotional leverage. "You're really going to do this?" he asked, his voice losing its control. "Walk away over money?" I shook my head slowly. I walked away over clarity. After that, the calls escalated. My mom called sobbing. My brother texted in all caps, panicking about everything falling apart. And then my dad started calling every number he had for me, over and over, from his phone, from my mom's, from the house line. I let them ring, not out of spite, but out of absolute necessity. In the weeks that followed, I watched the consequences unfold from a distance. My brother struggled desperately with expectations he'd never had to meet before. My mom grew quieter, more careful, finally forced to confront how often she'd smoothed over injustice instead of standing up for it. And my dad, who had always controlled the rhythm of our family, lost that control completely. He didn't know how to fix things without issuing commands. Meanwhile, my life settled into something steady, something honest. I found my own place. I focused on work, and my supervisor noticed. I started being recognized not as someone's reliable daughter, but as myself. One night, my phone buzzed again. A message from my dad. I didn't mean it the way it sounded. I stared at the words for a long time. Then I typed back, "Impact matters more than intent." He didn't reply. That was the moment I knew the confrontation was truly over. Not because he apologized, not because everything was repaired, but because I no longer needed him to understand in order to move forward. The power had shifted quietly, irrevocably, and the family I left behind would never operate the same way again. The fallout didn't happen all at once. It came in waves, uneven and uncomfortable, like a house settling after a quiet earthquake. My brother cracked first. Without me smoothing things over, reminding him of deadlines, explaining expectations, he floundered. He called more than once, voice tight, admitting he felt overwhelmed, not angry, not entitled, just scared. For the first time, he was standing where I had always stood, expected to figure things out without applause. I helped when I could, but I didn't step back into the role of buffer. That space stayed empty on purpose. My mom changed more slowly. She stopped leaving frantic voicemails and started sending short, almost hesitant messages instead. Apologies slipped in between updates about the house. She didn't name the favoritism outright, but she no longer pretended everything was fine. When we met for coffee weeks later, she looked tired in a way I hadn't seen before. Quieter. More honest. I realized my absence had forced her to sit with the discomfort she'd spent years avoiding. My dad was the last to add, just. Losing control didn't make him softer right away. It made him smaller. He ran out of orders to give, out of consequences to threaten. Without my rock-steady reliability to lean on, his authority simply stopped working the way it used to. He reached out less often, and when he did, his words were careful, measured, like he was learning a delicate language he'd never bothered with before. As for me, life stabilized in ways I hadn't expected. My days felt lighter. My work felt meaningful instead of draining. I paid my own bills on my own terms, in a space that belonged to me. People around me didn't praise my endurance. They respected my boundaries. I didn't get an apology that fixed everything. What I got was something quieter and more permanent. I got my sense of self back. And that turned out to be the most lasting consequence of all. I didn't go back to being the daughter who held everything together at her own crushing expense. I also didn't cut my family off like a dramatic ending in a movie. What I chose was something harder and quieter, distance with intention. Over time, the rules changed. Conversations slowed down. Expectations softened. My dad no longer spoke in ultimatums because they stopped working. My mom learned that peace built on silence eventually collapses. My brother grew into his own responsibilities, not because he was pushed, but because there was no one left to carry them for him. And me? I stopped measuring my worth by how useful I was to people who never planned to protect me the same way. I built a life that didn't require permission. One that felt steady, honest, and fully, irrevocably mine. Looking back, That dinner wasn't the moment my family broke. It was the moment the illusion finally did. Sometimes walking away isn't about punishment. It's about refusing to keep shrinking so others can stay comfortable. If this story hit close to home, I want you to know you're not weak for wanting fairness, and you're not selfish for choosing yourself. If you've ever had to step back from family to protect your sense of self, share your experience in the comments. Your story might be the one someone else needs to hear. And if you want more real stories like this, hit subscribe so you don't miss